The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind is the Tathagata. Today is the 7th day of this sesshin at Mountain Gate in December 2021. It is the Rohatsu sesshin, the sesshin that goes all the way through tonight into tomorrow morning as a replay, hopefully, of the Buddha's experience in that final night of what was the first sesshin ever, apparently. And that was when he was finally had decided that after 6 years of ascetic practice and doing various different things to try to come to awakening, he discovered that really the only way to do it was to go inward. And that is something that we all struggle with all the time until we get a handle on the fact that really it does make a difference to go inside, to tune into our bodies, to search within beyond words. It doesn't work. We cannot come to awakening by reading books. We might find inspiration in them. We can't find any way to come to awakening through talking to people, unless that is inspiring us to search within. And in general, over the millennia that people have been searching for whatever they wanted to call it. In the earliest years, the Christians did not have a name for what later became known as God. This is the case for many situations. And in order to help his students and people who followed him not to get attached to forms outside, the Buddha forbade any images of himself. And so the very first representations of the Buddha were the stupa, the burial stupa, where he was supposedly interred. Eventually, over the centuries, people did become earnestly wishing to have some form, at least for inspiration. And so Buddha figures were created. And they were created in the images of the peoples who created them. So, for example, the initial Buddha figures in India were fashioned after the Greek, the historical Greek sculptures, because it was the Greeks that actually created them. And then gradually, for example, if you go to Indonesia, you will see that the Buddha figures there have Indonesian facial features. In Thailand, they have Thai facial features. In Vietnam, they have Vietnamese facial features. There aren't really any Western Buddhas, as far as I know yet. As one of the dedications of the Rochester Zen Center, I don't remember what decade it was, a large figure of the Buddha was commissioned by a modern sculptor and placed in the garden. And Mitra-roshi wanted it to have a Western face, and in the end, it just has a blank visage, as if there were a stocking pulled over the face. In the end, it wasn't as successful as was hoped, but the idea in having these images of the facial structure of the culture that they are created in is to help people understand that every being is Buddha. Every being has this awakened mind that is called Buddha, that is called God, that is called Allah, that is called pure essence. And of course, in Islam, that mandate not to try to picture God has stayed in place. And again, there's a really good reason for this, because we cannot find it outside of ourselves, even though there is no inside, there is no outside. Perhaps that might be given as a reason why we can't find it outside, because there is no outside to find it in. It is closer to us than our own eyeballs. And someone long ago once said, the eye with which God sees you is the eye with which you see God, or vice versa. Since time immemorial, we have human beings been searching for this ineffable, unnameable, and we have called it different names just in order to communicate. And of course, over times, when it has developed into particular religions, those religions have gotten frozen into dogma, and that's not particularly helpful. The only way that we can come to awakening or know God intimately, experience our true nature, whatever you want to term it, is to forget ourselves. And the Mevlevi in Turkey, the whirling dervishes, do that through turning to the mournful playing of the flute, the ney. Christians, Jews, all search through prayer and forget themselves deeply enough in prayer, and there is understanding that comes forth. There's zikr in Islam, and in every religion there's some format for forgetting ourselves, for becoming so present with whatever it is, with Gregorian chant, with prayer, with zikr, with turning, with zazen, that who we think we are, who we assume we are, is forgotten. And when that is forgotten, there's a major mountain that is melted, the mountain that stands in our way of understanding who we are, of, if you want to say, meeting God face to face, except there is no me and no God to face off. It's very, very difficult to express this in words. But let me share the words of Huang Po, also known as Obaku in Japanese, Chinese master who was Rinzai's teacher. And this pretty well sums it up. All Buddhas and all ordinary beings are nothing but the one mind. This mind is beginningless and endless, unborn and indestructible. It has no color, no shape, neither exists nor doesn't exist. Isn't old or new, long or short, large or small, since it transcends all measures, limits, names, and comparisons. It is what you see in front of you. Start to think about it, and immediately you're mistaken. It is like the boundless void, which can't be fathomed or measured. And of course, the boundless void is not void. The boundless void is filled with potential. And out of this arise everything. And when the karma for whatever it is ended, then whatever that is returns to the void, disappears back into potentiality. And that is the case for us as well. What does happen when we die? The one mind is the Buddha, and there is no distinction between Buddha and ordinary beings, except that ordinary beings are attached to forms and thus seek for Buddhahood outside themselves. By this very seeking, they lose it, since they're using Buddha to seek for Buddha, using mind to seek for mind. When we try to analyze, when we try to investigate through words, through research, we're not going to do anything except add to our own burden of words. To forget the self, that is the most important thing. As Dogen said, to study the mind is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to become enlightened by the 10,000 things. To become enlightened by the 10,000 things is to remove the barrier between self and other. Even if they continue for a million eons, they will never be able to find it. They don't know that all they have to do is put a stop to conceptual thinking, and the Buddha will appear before them, because the mind is the Buddha, and the Buddha is all living beings. It is not any less for being manifested in ordinary beings, nor any greater for being manifested in Buddhas. And we can substitute any word we want for Buddha. Buddha simply means awakened. So here we are on the 7th day, and we have a big push ahead of us. Although push is perhaps not the right word, because we don't want to get into any striving mind states. It's more about sinking more deeply within. Sinking more deeply within. Letting go the edges. Searching so fully that we do forget ourselves. And whether or not we come to an awakening tonight is in some ways irrelevant, because the work is being done. And the work is done underground, beneath the conscious level normally. Every once in a while, you'll have an encounter with someone or have an experience that makes you realize that, oh, things have changed. And usually it's changed for the better, for the more positive. But in general, there's no grading system. And that's very important to recognize. We don't come to sesshin and take quizzes on our practice. There's no final exam at the end. And so that's a little bit challenging for many people who are accustomed to working in such a way. Our whole society, and I would say world society, except for small pockets here and there, is geared to trying to measure and weigh people's so-called progress. But in Zen, it can't be done. It's a process. It's an ongoing, unfolding process. And sometimes it feels like we're being successful, and sometimes it feels like we're being utter failures. And unless you have a teacher to guide you through this process, it's really a place where you can get caught. As I've said many times, sometimes, in fact, rather often, when it feels like you're having a real struggle in practice, you're actually making headway. And then there are times when it feels like you're just sailing through and feeling great, and everything is wonderful in terms of the focus. And that's a very dangerous place, because you can kind of sit down and hang out right there and dampen your seeming progress. The most important thing is not to judge your practice. And this is why faith is so very important. Faith is important in pretty much any religion, and for good reason. Because what we are seeking, no matter what the religion, is not an obvious thing. And it cannot be ordinarily found in the ways we are accustomed to our schooling. So the most important thing a person can do when doing Zen practice or any spiritual practice is not to try to estimate where you're at in the practice. It can be very difficult. It can be very easy. It's going to be both at different times. And the most important thing is to keep going. And this is why great stubbornness, if you want to call it that, persistence, patient endurance is so important. What you're doing is reaching beyond the ordinary. And there are no guidelines for that other than don't think about it. It's as if you were suddenly put into a dark room, pitch black room, a very strange room in a very strange place. And you're told, okay, now you got to get out of this room. How are you going to figure out how to get it? You stumble around, bumping into whatever happens to be in the room, putting your hands out, trying to find a wall, a door, a window, some way of moving out. That's what Zen practice is really like. And the more we can embody that practice, experience it, reach, fueled by the yearning that has carried us to practice, eventually it will unfold in ways that you will become aware of. And I think here of Flora Courtois, the American woman who was trying to find something, some truth that was always true, regardless of circumstances. And it became a very compelling search for her. And she tried all kinds of outward ways of searching, and finally realized that she could only find it if she went within herself and searched within. And you can't even speak of it in words, because to say search within, how can you describe that? It's a sinking into the yearning that is what's most important. And to have faith that as you continue that long enough, gradually the veil, so to speak, will clear, and you'll begin to see more clearly. So in her case, she was deeply involved in this process. And in fact, at one point she was in college at the time, and she was seated front and center in front of a visiting British professor in some course or other. And she was drawn deeply within to this quest of hers. And suddenly she had a little bit of an insight, and she must have had such an expression on her face that apparently this visiting professor stopped his lecture mid-sentence to peer down at her and ask her if everything was okay. It was an adventure. It was an ongoing venture. She was deeply committed to this search, and it got more deeply committed as time went on. Interestingly, she had a couple of what she called visions. One was that she was part of a cave-dwelling family in ancient times, and they decided to dare to go look outside the cave instead of staying within the safety of the cave. This is a real metaphor for the human condition. We live in our own cave. It's a cave proscribed by society, but it's invested in by each person in society. And if we try to jump out of that cave, society tries to push us back in. At any rate, she and the family went out to the opening of the cave, and she was just amazed at this vast landscape of light. And she was eager to explore it. And to her dismay, the family decided to go back into the cave. And she wrote that she realized at that point that she was going to have to go it alone. Remember that she was doing this in the very, very early 1930s, before Zen was very well known in the United States. It had come to the United States in, 1896, the World Parliament of Religions, when a monk, a Rinzai monk actually, who had trained at Sogenji, came to help people understand what Buddhism was, or to introduce Buddhism, really. And from there, it began to trickle in, but only minimally. And it wasn't until the 1950s and 1960s when there became Zen teachers teaching Americans in America that it began to get more known and more involved in. So she kept searching inwardly, Another vision that she had, and this also is prescient, was that she was working in a gray nondescript building, and without seeing them, there were other people she knew. There were other people also working in that building. And she was sitting, her work was to sit at this little gray desk and manipulate colored blocks. And one day, for no good reason, she turned around. And amazingly, there was this great, large window facing her now. And through the window, she could see this amazing vista, a field filled with flowers, stream running through, brilliant sky, and butterflies, and so on and so forth. And she was so entranced, she walked out the window. It was one of those great big tall windows that back in the old days they had in houses, and you could actually walk out them. And so she did. She walked out, and it was stupendous. It was phenomenal. And she was so excited by this view that she'd never realized existed, that she wanted to share it with the other people working in this building. And as soon as she came back into the room, she found she had no words to describe it. That was the beginning of an insight that eventually led to something much, much, much deeper that was alive for her 20 years later. How did it happen? She continued searching inwardly. And by now, as you know, she was not trying to find any answers outside. She kept searching, she kept searching, she kept searching. And then one day when she was home and in her bedroom, she glanced at her desk and she wrote, "The world turned on its axis." And nothing was the same for her after that. She had been set to get a PhD in psychology, and she changed it to a master's instead. Graduated, ended up getting married and having a son, and moving to California, to Southern California. And still trying to figure out what on earth had happened. But her life was filled with ease, filled with joy. And she carried on, and eventually she discovered Alan Watts, who had a little group of people in his living room talking about Zen. And she began to realize that this thing called enlightenment, which they were talking about, was what had happened to her. And from Alan Watts, she discovered Miyazumi, Taizan Miyazumi, who was just sensei back then, and what became the Zen Center of Los Angeles was holding forth in the basement of a church. And she started doing Zazen with him. And it wasn't until he asked her to drive some visiting priests up to Tassajara in Northern California, and one of them was Mitra-roshi, that she thought, maybe I could ask him about this experience that I had. She had vowed, after a few very early attempts, right after it happened, never to speak of it again until she found somebody that would understand. And so with Miyazumi translating, she told Mitra-roshi, she described the whole thing. And he was so convinced that it was still functioning for her, still alive for her. And here's the thing about coming to awakening. It has to function. To have an insight, no matter how shallow or deep, is of very little use other than perhaps to grow us an extra head on top of our head and expand our ego. It has to function in our life. In other words, what you realize through these insights, through this Kensho, through this Satori, and hopefully multiple Satoris, is coming to life in your own life. In other words, when you see where you're not behaving in line with what you've realized, you pull yourself up short and you don't go there anymore. You stop behaving like that. One of the most impressive things about Roshi Kapleau was that he constantly was working on himself. I wouldn't even say constantly, he was always working on himself. And when he discovered, it became clear to him that there was some behavior that he had that was not as helpful, wasn't as compassionate, was maybe caught in self-image, in an ego trip. As soon as he saw that, it was gone. It never happened again. It was remarkable. I watched this happen over and over again. He continued working on himself his entire rest of his life. And this is what Zen practice is. It's about working to embody any realization that we have, and to continue to deepen and open immeasurably. So you can read Flora's whole story if you want. When she died, she bequeathed the rights to it. By the way, she didn't just write it. Mitra-roshi asked her to write it. I don't think she would have written it down otherwise. But I'm very grateful that she did, because it was a huge source of inspiration to me and to many, many, many other people. And so ZCLA kind of sat on it for a while, for some years. And then finally, when they republished a book of Mitra-roshi's teachings called Hazy Moon of Enlightenment, they included her story as an extra couple of chapters at the end. So if you want to read her story, because the original Quest book published version of it is long, long, long out of print, then go to Amazon.com or wherever, your local bookstore, and get a copy of the latest edition of Hazy Moon of Enlightenment. And you can read the whole thing. It is a never-ending source of inspiration to myself and to many, many people. It's the story of an American woman, contemporary American woman. I knew her personally, and she was a lovely human being. And you know, knowing that somebody contemporary has had that depth of awakening gives us all inspiration that we too can do it. And we can. And I hope we all do. And it matters not whether we have a religion from birth, a spiritual practice from birth. Zen practice is one way to go about coming to awakening. There are stories of people in prison, in the gulag, having sudden awakening experiences. There is Jacques Lutheran, who in the 1940s was a prisoner in Buchenwald and came to profound awakening. And of course, then there are the usual stories of, for example, Meister Eckhart or Juan de la Cruz in Christianity, and Rumi and the Sufi mystics, and many, many, many others that are most likely not even published. It is something that every single one of us can do if we put our minds to it. If we are determined, if we have faith, we can do it, and if we persist. And so in this, I don't want to call it a final day because it's not final yet. Sesshin won't end until the Enlightenment, the Buddha's Enlightenment ceremony tomorrow morning during our regular chanting period. So if you are up for it, sit the night through. It's amazing what can happen, even if you're sleepy, even if you're tired. And it could make all the difference in the world. However, if you have been staying up all night or a good part of the night, or waking up extremely early during sesshin, the Buddha taught, after all, the middle way. We don't want to go too extreme. We want to push the envelope. We want to go beyond ourselves, but we don't want to go into extremity. So carry on, everyone. It's wonderful to have you here either by Zoom or in the Zendo proper, and to be doing this together along with so many people all over the world. So I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.